Good morning, friends. I'm going to tell a few stories. This is kind of sitting around the campfire, telling stories late into the night, except it's not night at the moment. But whenever you're watching this in the future, I want to pass on some lore, basically. When I taught in Chicago for teachers learning Python or maybe learning a new curriculum in which Python was featured, I shared my theory that you need to oscillate between very technical, sort of heads down, looking at number crunchy stuff or just technical stuff, and then you needed to go back up and talk. By going back up, I mean I kind of had this idea of a swivel arrow, kind of like in economics, the opportunity cost arrow, where we would talk more lore, more sort of storytelling, and then go back to technical. It's this oscillation that actually ends up giving you more information because the brain wears out if you're doing one or the other to the exclusion of the other. In other words, oscillation is the key. I think we see this in electricity too. It's the change in current, the change in magnetic fields that gives us work and energy. It's things staying the same that we gradually tune out. So I try to vary the diet, you could say. What I'm showing on the screen are interconnected memes relating to the literature I tend to explore the most, which you can start your story in many different places. Some people will start it with Alexander Graham Bell and his lesser known studies after he'd invented the telephone, and therefore he had the sort of security, the financial security to just really dive into things that really mattered to him. And this space frame, later patented by Fuller, called the octet truss, is one of those exploration projects. That's a picture of Bell right there, and his wife inside the tetrahedron. Prologue by R. Buckminster Fuller, because here's another American who spent his time thinking and developing the octet truss, the same thing. And Fuller's like, yeah, that's exactly the same, and I had no idea that Bucky had no idea that Bell had been working in this area. And I remember I had no idea. I went through all of high school and 4 years of college and never really tuned in, for example, the Dymaxion House. I didn't really know about it. It's not really part of American history. It sits in the Henry Ford Museum, and people kind of stand around helpless because it's like, wow, that looks like a great idea. And when you see it all furnished and in pristine condition, now this is not the Dymaxion House, this is the housing built on the Butler grain bin. You can see how similar this looks to like a refugee camp. These are, you could say, economic refugees in a way, in that they're opting out of the rat race and going into a military context. As you may recall from Fuller's biography, he was doing great in the Navy. It's when he had to go and, quote, earn a living in Chicago that things kind of fell apart for him and pushed him to the brink of suicide. And I think a lot of people need to continue to be in that military world just because they don't find anywhere safe once they're done and they're pushed back on the streets, and we have homeless vets and that whole story. It's required though that you have housing for all these people. So the Butler grain bins was a first draft, and you'll notice these people are in uniform, right? That was like chapter 1 of Fuller's saga. Chapter 2 was the car, the Dymaxion car, and chapter 3 is this Dymaxion house. You can see it's metallic, but it's a very thin amount of metal. I don't know how much noise or racket the rain would make on this. It's very similar to an Airstream trailer, which I understand also has heritage in the airplane business. And it was in Wichita, Kansas, at the Beech Aircraft Factory after World War II that Fuller developed this model for a house of the future. Notice it's not a dome. That was yet a later chapter. So Butler Grain Bin, Dymaxion Car, Dymaxion House, and later the geodesic dome. Now, what is so terrible about this house, right? It's never really been mass produced. No one's ever really tried to pick up where Fuller left off or really gone into mass produced housing except in the manufactured housing and mobile home sector, where we don't use aerospace technology. We don't think in terms of delivery in quite the same way and assembly on site. Like, the great thing about a mobile home is you can pull it in halves by behind a truck and then join the two halves together if it's a double wide. Whereas a house like this would probably need to show up in a shipping container somehow and be assembled on site, perhaps. The air delivery thing that he talked about, um, I don't know if that was intended to be used for Dymaxion houses. I don't think so. That was more for some domes could be transported by helicopter and were. So then we have these kind of models for public displays. This is a world game sort of headquarters where you can see the world map and possibly real-time data would be displayed. Very futuristic. It's this kind of futurism, though, that gives people some sense of where we're going. And you'll know that at World's Fairs, they were showing off for a while, say, the freeway system of tomorrow. How we'll all have on-ramps and off-ramps and these cloverleaf intersections. That much was clear to people, and industry was ready to share that with the public, get them ready, so people had something to look forward to and anticipate. And the question I have now is, what do we have to look forward to and anticipate? What are we being shown? And I'm like trying to, I guess, reignite the mass-produced housing solution, something outside of the current mobile home industry, something more aerospace. If you've seen Real Player One, where they just stack mobile homes on top of each other, isn't that the name of that movie? Like, that's dystopian. We have these views of the future based on the present that aren't very informed with higher tech. It's like once you level off and just extrapolate from what we've got, things look a little bit bleak. And I think that's why we're seeing a rise around the world in, I would say, cruelty. And I justify thinking that way by my own childhood. I've told the story of how I was able to go through the Khyber Pass as a kid with my parents on a public bus from Peshawar to Kabul. And in another chapter, I was able to go to Ramallah. I lived in a tent with other students, so you could see where I'm coming from with the campus as camp. We actually physically lived in tents in a part of Ramallah that wasn't nearly as developed as today at all, and started building a swimming pool out of solid rock. And the Palestinian contractors who were actually blasting, they could get dynamite, no problem, and my job was to help shovel pound the rock fragments into smaller pieces and put them into a wheelbarrow and truck it off to the dumping ground. So it was very prosaic. Use a sledgehammer to crack stones. That's like what we see in the cartoons that, prisoners do and stuff. But this was no prison camp. This was a camp to get to know Palestinians. And then in chapter 2 of that experience, we went to a kibbutz and met with a lot of Israelis. And this was in the 70s. And this was, I would say, in a much more hopeful time in a way. Hope has been draining away. And I think it's partly because we've turned our back on the positive future memes that are part of our heritage. And is that a smart choice? And I use the analogy of Git and branches and merging and so on. And I'm talking to the geeks now and I'm saying, hey, we can go back to branches we've abandoned in science, in engineering, in the humanities, and we don't have to say, well, because they've been abandoned for a while, therefore there's nothing there. It's like reopening a lost mine that still had gold in it. There's a lot of gold we just kind of walked away from. Now I'm going to finish up just talking a little bit. Now I'm going to do my thing and get away from storytelling and dive into technical a little bit. If you've looked at my videos, I have a lot of them by now. I started making them in earnest last November, so I've made hundreds. And I get passionate about it because I do feel that this is a time to take a stand against creeping fascism. And I'm not blaming any one particular party or president or something like that. If you explore my writings, I don't demonize really. I do think there's a goodness in the hearts of people and a willingness to make things better if they can see a way to do that. Now, I bring in quadres just again to spark the imagination and not to attempt some kind of revolutionary takeover of vector math. I'm always like trying to help people not get defensive when we bring up anything a little bit esoteric or different in the math world, because that's a space where you're just supposed to march forward, not looking left or right, it seems, until you get to the front lines. And it takes years to get there. And once you get your PhD in math, then you can start to contribute in ways that only other PhDs will understand. It's very specialized. Whereas this quadre branch is way back in like the high school level. We could teach this, to very young people, and if they've already looked at the XYZ coordinate system, they're already going to have what they need to understand this sort of exotic alternative, which I have in Python, and therefore I have this Q vector class, which takes the four vectors of the tetrahedron going from the center to the four corners and labels them with four tuples. In other words, 1 0 0 0 and 0 1 0 0 and 0 0 1 0 and 0 0 0 1. So you see what I'm doing there. I learned this on the Synergetics L list. There are other people who are working on it in parallel. This was kind of in the zeitgeist, as things often are, right? People think of these things. And then what I discovered is, well, I discovered how to generate the FCC sphere packing with whole number positive coordinates. That's something that I do in that other Jupyter notebook where I have YouTubes about that already. But what I'm going to do now in Python is just map the Q vector class across these initializing coordinates. In other words, I'm going to eat all these permutations of 0, 1, 0, 0 and make Q vectors out of them. And I'm going to call those A, B, C, D. So here I do it. A, B, C, D are now the four Q vectors. And then I'm going to Wikipedia and looking at this chart, and I'm seeing, oh, the inverse tetrahedron. In other words, the tetrahedron that's pointing the other way. Like, I have a tetrahedron here, a big one. Back to flextegrity here. I call this C60, but it's really, C60 is one of several versions of flextegrity. And this is just a tetrahedron. Now, you know that there's what's called stella octangula, right? Kepler was into this. Another tetrahedron, an inverse tetrahedron, that the points stick out and basically form the other four corners of a cube, because a cube has 8 corners, and this will be 4 of those corners with face diagonals connecting corner to corner, cube face diagonals. So every face has a crisscross. You can have the other 4 face diagonals as opposed to the ones you already have. So this will be tetrahedron number 1, and then you have tetrahedron number 2. So that's why we call the cube in synergetics the duotet sometimes, because it's made from 2 tetrahedrons. And so I'm going to create those other 4 vertices of that other oppositely pointing, you could say, tetrahedron. simply by adding existing the 4 Q vectors that I have created. I'm going to add those and in triples and get the 4 that point the other way. And it's easy to see what I'm doing. Now you'll read in the history of vector analysis, which I hold up from time to time, that this was kind of a breakthrough when it occurred. And, it wasn't like always part of math that you could do this. But you know what vector addition looks like, right? If I have these 2 vectors and I want to add them, so I say, let's add these 2 vectors. You're saying, let's just go tip to tail. You're allowed to move a vector. You're saying, I'm starting here, and I'm going to add this vector and this vector. Well, the result is as if I follow one tip to tail, or tail to tip, and then pick up on the other. I can slide the other over, and it's the connecting vector that goes straight from, so this is A to B, B to C. A to C is the vector sum, right? All the way to the end. So one vector plus one vector, and it's commutative, right? I could do it this way instead, right? So that's all we're doing. We're doing the same exact vector addition operation in quadrats, except we're saying, okay, so if I add any 3 in a quadrant, and if I just pick 3, I'm going to be in a quadrant. It's going to define a quadrant. Those 3 basis vectors, I'll call them basis vectors, is going to define a vector that goes basically straight out from the center through the center of this triangle, all the way to the oppositely pointing tetrahedron's vertex. So I'm getting the duotet tetrahedron from the first set of 4. I'm getting the next set of 4. And then I go on in this diagram to get, there's a 26 letters, just works out that way, of interest. The duotet cube, I just repeat what I've already defined, right? Because I've got the 2 tetrahedrons. So the cube can be defined A through H. Then I can go on and build the octahedron, given vectors I've already defined. And the rhombic dodecahedron is thereby defined because the cube and octahedron, its dual, together, those are the points of the rhombic dodecahedron, space filler. And then I can also go on and define the points I need for the cube octahedron, which are 12 points. Now it looks like I only have 6 here. Why not 12? Let's see why, because some of them are already defined. Oh no, I've done it in 2 groups of 6 here. I did write this page, so there's 6 of the vertices, and here's the other 6. 6 plus 6 is 12, built on vectors so far. So in other words, starting with a tetrahedron and doing simple vector addition only, you're able to generate all the 26 points of this concentric hierarchy. Now what's missing from this are any of the 5-fold symmetric, rhombic tricontahedron, icosahedron, stuff like that. And that's where the jitterbug comes in. Once you have those 20 points of the cube octahedron, this transformation going from cube octahedron to icosahedron is how you get to the icosahedron from the cube octahedron. And then the dual of that icosahedron is the Platonic pentagonal dodecahedron. And when you add 2 duals that crisscross each other, so you define dual in terms of that they have crisscrossed edges, then you get sort of a Genesis story. In other words, you can create the cube by crisscrossing the 2 tetrahedron, the duotet, and you can get the rhombic dodecahedron by crisscrossing the dual of the cube with the octahedron, duals of each other. Ditto, when you get to the icosahedron, crisscross it with the pentagonal dodecahedron to get the rhombic tricontahedron. So we're being this is what I would call technical talk, but those were the Platonic 5 that I started with. And then what I derived from those was all based on the duals, and it's arranging those concentrically and giving them whole number volumes in some cases that we get the so-called concentric hierarchy embedded in the fuller literature, from which we also get this positive futurism. So you can see my agenda. It's like, if we can get the Platonic Five and the duals to tell a story and create a concentric hierarchy and understand the streamlining mnemonic value, at least, of the whole number volumes, then we have a wedge into a literature that is helping house the military and the civilians. So we need to house both, because once you're a career military, it's not clear that you're going to be able to survive as a civilian. So I'm not trying to change people's lifestyle in such a dramatic manner. And then we have refugees of other kinds, just plain refugees, right? These Butler grain bins. I notice IKEA is working on shelters. So what about something with more tension in it? What about hanging from a pole? What about going back and visiting the Dymaxion House? It's so high tech. You look at it now in 2019, and it looks more high tech and futuristic than a mobile home by a long shot. In other words, we're living in the past in a way. They call this Yesterland in the picture. Isn't it interesting that we're less civilized, right? Based on those stories I was saying. I used to be able to travel the world and feel a lot safer and a lot better about the future than I do now. And I think it's because we took some wrong turns and we just turned our back on our own heritage. And now we don't teach it. Look how old that car is in this picture. These folks were mentally ahead of us. So it's kind of like, what's the opposite of a renaissance, where you go backwards? And how do we spark a renaissance where we go back to where we left off and try, before it's too late, to recover a possible future, a brighter future? I'm not saying we have to use the Dymaxion House exactly, but I'm saying, what do we have that's better, and who's working on it? And why is it considered acceptable for aerospace to make all its profits just doing weapons of mass murder? That just seems wrong. And the governments are now just in the weapons of mass murder business. As Johnson said, it's President Johnson, it's murder incorporated around here. Basically, we're in an era of organized crime is in control. And people know that, but they're not sure how to get out of it. And I think the answer is not necessarily through who you vote for, as much as what curriculum we use. And this can be, it's not starting all over. It's like, well, we'll never get there if we just start with 3-year-olds. We've got to do something faster. We'll teach adults andragogy. When I say education and curriculum, I'm not talking about little kids entirely. I'm talking about people older than you. People older than you can also learn new tricks. Curriculum is all ages, all ages. So curriculum reform these days is through media like YouTube, like what I'm doing right here. So this is me walking my talk. I'm saying, hey, I want to make little movies about positive futurism that incorporate the elements of a new curriculum and use the artifacts that we'll be using, the so-called calculator of tomorrow. This kind of thing, where I'm generating these vectors interactively in a Jupyter notebook. Why can't we do this in high school anyway, right? Even if we're not doing Q-rays. That's the kind of question I ask. Talk to you soon.